Okay, welcome back for Chapter 11, Pastoral Peoples on the Global Stage, the Mongol Moment. The Mongol Empire is a central topic in world history because of its tremendous geographic scope and influence on a broad sweep of history. The rise of the Mongols represents a watershed moment for the history of several Eurasian regions like China, the Middle East, Russia, and especially Central Asia. The dramatic aspects of the Mongol story really could be fascinating for you guys. You really get into it. And when learning about the Mongols and discussing the Mongols, keep in mind the various themes of our AP World History class so that the military aspects of their role don't overrun their broad and longer-term effects on Eurasian society, because that's equally as important. Okay, so let's describe this painting. What different kinds of actions are represented here? I know it's a busy painting, and there's a lot going on in this visual, but let's look at some of the different actions represented here. We see men in battle, some men in prayer. There's a group of mounted warriors armed with spears and bows and arrows in the bottom right corner of the image. It seems to be attacking an encampment across a river, where warriors in similar armor and weaponry seem to be mounting a counterattack. In the upper left-hand corner of the image, we see warriors on horseback riding into a camp of tents where looks like these men are fleeing in terror. And the dominance of warriors on horseback, the tent encampment, the turbans, and other clothing and headgear suggest that this is a battle in Central Asia among nomadic tribes. So who is the central figure in this picture? And let's see if we can explain his position in this image. Well, the central figure in this image is Genghis Khan in the top right corner. He seems to be praying probably for guidance in this ongoing battle. And behind him stand three men in turbans, their hands lifted up as if in prayer themselves or a sign of deference to Genghis Khan. And directly below him stands a man holding what is most likely the Khan's horse. It's not clear whether the artist has deliberately painted Genghis Khan as if hovering above the ground, or whether he knelt on an outcropping of rocks. It's hard to determine. That's not clear. Either way, it shows the Khan high above the tumultuous battle that's taking place below him in a pose of calm concentration. And that's part of his leadership skills. So the legacy of Genghis Khan in Mongolia, his spirit banner was destroyed by communists in 1937. There was a late 20th century revival of his memory. In 2006, it was the 800th anniversary of the foundation of the Mongol Empire. So the story of the Mongols is an important corrective to historians' focus on agriculturalists, because the Mongols, after amassing the largest land empire in history, they were pastoralists and nomadic. And we've been focusing so much on agriculturalists. Well, here comes, this corrective to the focus on agriculturalists. Now we have a big moment for the nomads. Okay, so let's start with looking back and around the long history of pastoral nomads. Their economies really focused on livestock production, and that emerged around 4000 BCE. They were dependent on horses, camels, goats, sheep, cattle, yaks, even reindeer. And these pastoral societies developed in the grasslands of Eurasia and sub-Saharan Africa, Arabia and the Saharan deserts, subarctic regions, the Tibetan Plateau, but not in the Americas. There was a lack of large animals for domestication, so not necessarily in the Americas. Now, some of the standard features of pastoral societies include, and by the way, we started the world of pastoral societies, generally less productive than agricultural societies. They needed large grazing areas, and their populations were much smaller than agricultural societies. So we're talking small populations on large amounts of land. They, like I said, they were less productive than the settled agriculturalists, and that was, and that resulted in those smaller populations that required those larger expanses of land. They specialized in making a living off unproductive land. These grasslands could not sustain humans. They could not sustain their herds of animals, they could sustain their herds of animals. So the pastoralists lived off meat, milk, and blood rather than grains. They lived in encampments of related kinfolk, usually a common ancestry along the male line. And the clans sometimes gathered as a tribe. They could even absorb unrelated people into their tribe, and they were essentially more egalitarian than sedentary societies. Sometimes they distinguished between nobles and commoners, and so thus developed high levels of social and gender equality. With the low population density and relatively simple social structures, these societies enjoyed much greater social equality than their settled neighbors. And women engaged in most of the same tasks as men in terms of raising the herd and even riding. And thus women usually had a higher status and greater freedom than those sedentary communities. And of course they were mobile. They're nomads. So they're mobile but in contact with those settled agriculturalists. They had deep connections with their agricultural neighbors. They sought access to foodstuffs, manufactured goods, even some of the luxury items, especially in Inner Eurasia. Longing for civilized products encouraged a formation of nomadic states. And while they were a mobile population that lived off their animals, they still needed the products of settled societies. Thus, even though they might disdain, the agriculturalists, they were frequently in contact with them and exchanged their animal products for manufactured goods from those towns and cities. For the formation of nomadic states, that's rather difficult. It took charismatic leaders, specifically Genghis Khan, to make a series of tribal alliances, and thus they became a powerful state. And when it formed, almost the whole male population, and even some women, became warriors. This was held together as long as wealth flowed into those pastoral states. These tribal alliances and military power of horsemen was essential to the formation of the Mongol Empire. Without the urban centers, it was very difficult to sustain a state system. But there are a few charismatic individuals, such as Genghis Khan, that could forge these kind of alliances. And the strength of the union was dependent on that wealth coming into the pastoral states. Otherwise, it would fall apart, and their, economic fortune, could disintegrate. There's also cultural interaction, not just economic interaction or social interaction, but cultural interaction with these agricultural lands. Inner Eurasian nomads adopted Judaism and Christianity, Islam, and even Manichaeism at various times. And they actually, they were so good at their environment. They mastered an environment that was unsuitable for agriculture. They brought food-producing revolution and significant human presence to these fringe regions. out here that were marginalized. And life changed significantly for Interasian steppe peoples with the introduction of horseback riding around 1000 BCE. They became excellent horsemen, especially with the development of the stirrup and then later the saddle. They could effectively ride those horses, and they became very talented horsemen. And thus develops, now we're on before the Mongols, pastoralists in history. Thus developed mounted warfare, and that made nomadic empires possible. The Xiongnu in the Mongolian steppes in the northern part of China formed an important early confederacy. This was about from Manchuria to around Central Asia, and that was in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE. They created then the ruler Modun revolutionized nomadic life. He created a more centralized, hierarchical political system, similar to those in agricultural societies. And he portrayed himself as a divinely sanctioned ruler, so having support from the gods. And a distinction between junior and senior clans became more important. So we see that's part of the hierarchical development in their society. And they even exacted tribute from other nomads and China. And the Xiongnu Empire model was copied by the Turkic and the Mongol empires, 2 other nomadic empires that became very important. So first, let's look at the Arabs and the Turks. The nomads made their greatest impact on world history around 500 to 1500 CE. The Arabs, the Berbers, the Turks, and the Mongols all created the largest empires of that millennium. Islam derived from largely nomadic Arabs carried by the Turks. In Byzantium, Persia, and China, they were all controlled, at least for a time, by those formerly nomadic people, thus explaining their importance. Now, in the Middle East, the Bedouin Arabs became very effective and fierce fighters with the development of a really good camel saddle. That's believed anywhere from 500 to 100 BCE. It made control of the trade routes through Arabia possible. And these camel nomads were the shock troops of Islamic expansion. They were very important to the expansion of Islam, especially in northern Africa along the sand roads. And the Turkic-speaking nomads, their homeland in Mongolia and even southern Siberia, their movement was a gradual southward, westward spread. There's a series of some short-lived nomadic empires, the 550s to the 950s CE, and they spread the Turkic language and culture over much of Interasia and even beyond. And the Turkish conversion to Islam occurred between the 10th and 14th centuries. Great examples: the Seljuk Empire, the 11th to 12th centuries. The Turks began to claim the Muslim title Sultan and actually exercised real power. And so this is when the nomadic Turks really take on Islam and becoming Muslims and using their title, Sultan. And they carried Islam to India and Anatolia, which is present-day Turkey. And the Berber societies of North Africa and the Sahara emerged with the introduction of the camel into the region. And, of course, we know the importance of the camel on the trade routes along the sand roads. They also adopted Islam. And even the Sahaja Berbers in Western Sahara built the Almoravid Empire in the 1000s. And that encompassed much of northwestern Africa and southern Spain even. But it collapsed about the mid-12th century or so. The Berber people converted to Islam. They were more superficial in their practice. After 1039, Ibn Yasin, a scholar, launched a reform campaign to make the practice of the faith more orthodox. And soon the movement became an expansionist state that moved into Spain, controlled much of present-day Morocco. And we've learned about the spread of Islam already. And like other examples, the Almoravids became urbanized, and they enjoyed even impressive art and architecture and an expansion of literature as well. But there was a variety of Turkic-speaking peoples that came out of the steppes of Central Asia and threatened some of those settled agricultural empires. And soon aspects of the Turkic culture influenced the northern Chinese court. The Seljuk Turks fought a series of wars with Byzantium, but it was the Ottoman Turks that finally overthrew the last vestige of Rome in 453. And upon that happening, the Ottomans became a very urban society and culture. And that is the end of section 1. I'd like to show you some maps. First one here shows you the Xiongnu Confederation. Hopefully you get an idea of how large this actually is. If you could look at, I know it's kind of hard to tell the way this map has been drawn, but if you can really look at the difference between how far Lake Baikal and the Aral Sea are from each other, give you a good idea what we're talking about here. Because, this is all the way over into Pakistan, and then we see the East China Sea. So, and Korea is up here. Of course, Japan is out here that we can't see. But this is around the time of the Han Dynasty in China. Remember, this is about the same time as Rome. The Han Dynasty collapsed a couple hundred years before Rome, but this gives you a good idea. So the Xiongnu Confederation is much earlier than the Mongols, but they're the ancestors of the Mongols, because up here in this area, this is Mongolia and even Manchuria, and of course this is southern Siberia up here. And then this last one shows you the Almoravid Empire, what I was talking about in the Western Sahara, right? That even spread up into Spain and parts of Portugal. And those of you, I believe we had someone who did Cordoba. I don't know, I can't remember if someone did Sevilla, this town right here. But all very important. So I wanted to give you a good showing of this. And of course, Castile and Leon in France, and Navarre and Aragon in Spain. Not in France. Excuse me, all in Spain up here, you can see. Of course, are also very important cities, but it gives you a good idea of where we're talking about here and what's going on. And that's it.